Hey there everyone, this is Luke and welcome back to ThursDev. Last week we talked about budgeting for your game. We covered the concept of the man month and how it's the tool of choice for calculating costs of a project when trying to plan for an inevitably long engagement. I'm glad to say that even in the week since it's aired, I've seen a fairly healthy number of people on game development forums asking these sorts of questions, so I'm glad that I created something that might be helping my peers in one way or another. Now, we've talked a little bit about how one can calculate cost of doing things from scratch, and that's extremely valuable, of course, but I think it should perhaps go without saying that creating everything from scratch every time you want to create a new game is just madness. As we saw, a single high-quality character from one industry average artist is already costing a small fortune to make, right? Well, obviously we could make a value judgment on our Q. Remember QCD from the last video? That's a quality judgment, but there are going to be some corners you cut and some that you should avoid as a last possible resort. So how can we mitigate this kind of cost a little bit? Well, I'm going to make a positive argument for something that, by all rights, is seen often by the gamer community as some kind of major faux pas, or at least a slight against their gamer sensibilities. Some are more blatant than others, certainly, but others much less so, and now and then that's where the biggest complaints stem from. Watch the more vocal parts of the internet anytime a new game comes out, by which I mean check gaming on Reddit or check game news outlets about 3 or 4 days later. If the game's a sequel, there's a good chance that eventually someone is going to attempt to kick up a stink about something that's copy-pasted from a previous game in the series. The higher profile, the better, like good old Call of Duty Ghosts, which shares a few similarities with other Modern Warfare games. It's not overly difficult to see that some multiplayer maps share similar designs, but have been completely remodeled, for example, or the ending sequence sharing the same motion-captured animation. Obviously, Activision killed off all of our respective grandmothers by doing this. So, yeah, maybe it's not necessarily just because they did it. A close look proves out that it's just a good layout they wanted to reuse, but otherwise is distinctly different. But people were decrying the lack of transparency, saying, Infinity Ward should have told us, I guess. But what if I told you that this is really common practice in the video game industry? Like, even between completely different games. If you have a problem with the issue of asset reuse in a sequel, then this might just blow your mind. Today I'd like to take a look at how and when and why game creators reuse things from other games. Ready? Here we go. Like many development choices made during the overall creation of video games, this is motivated by cost. That alone is going to turn off a lot of gamers that think that games should always be developed to perfection without regard for cost. But these are the same people who don't get how much making games costs, and really that's kind of a pipe dream. I covered that, however, already, so I'm just going to move right past it and make the dangerous assumption that people are already coming from a position of at least open-minded skepticism. I'm going to disclude game engines from this, of course. We're mostly beyond the days where developers were making every single game completely from scratch, so let's call reuse of the game development framework a given, and the notion that it could be a negative absurd. Though many might argue that some engines are just a bad choice in modern game development landscape, and in some cases, they might not be wrong. But there are some even interesting reuses in this field. It's no secret that Lumberyard is CryEngine. It's widely stated. Fewer people might be aware of the fact that the Creation Engine, the engine that powers Skyrim and Fallout 4, are evolutions of Emergent Technology's Gamebryo engine. Make no mistake, Creation is not Gamebryo. It's evolved beyond the shackles of its previous form, especially in the realm of graphics rendering, but it remains one of the few engines that does open-world gaming as well as it does, and for that reason, ZeniMax and Bethesda would have been foolish to try and start from scratch. I worked at a company called Acquire for a few years, who had a subsidiary company called ZeroDiv, which in turn was founded by key members of the then-defunct studio Microsoft. Microsoft was the studio that created Wizardry X, which was a reasonably successful game in the venerable Wizardry series on PlayStation 2. But when the company was dissolved, it reformed eventually as ZeroDiv, and the owner and president, Takayuki Harakami, maintained ownership of the source code of Ext, which was then ultimately used in the creation of the Class of Heroes games, and into the Wizardry Renaissance series and beyond. But let's move onward to things that are on a more micro scale. Most games make use of something or other that already existed before the project was made. This could be in the form of art assets like meshes, animations, UI elements. All of those things are totally normal to see, though admittedly some of them are not so easy to spot. But code is not uncommon either. I'm not honestly sure if people are such purists that they might have the misconception that everything is rewritten every time a studio starts developing a new title, but you might not realize how prolific it really is, even across multiple seemingly unrelated games. Did you realize that Capcom's DuckTales is essentially Mega Man? Obviously, there were new mechanics introduced, like static level objects that could be golf clubbed towards an enemy, but it should really come as no surprise that the two games are amazingly similar. DuckTales was visually larger, with Scrooge taking up more of his 32 by 32 pixel sprite than the more diminutive Rockman sprite did, and he could jump an additional 16 by 16 tile of height. But aside from minor differences in scale, add DuckTales' iconic pogo mechanic, which I'll bet is where the rush coil came from in the following year's Mega Man 3, and you're all set. Seriously, check out the jump arc, the movement speed. It's really obvious when you spend a moment to look at it. What sets these games apart, though, is its theming, which is a powerful thing, and aside from the sake of comparison, nobody would truly accuse DuckTales of being a so-called copy-paste of Mega Man. It's just smart reuse of existing code. So let's look at a little bit bigger then. Sometimes the most fun reuses are also the most unassuming. Did you suspect, perhaps, that the foliage found within the wealthy Orbis stations of Elite Dangerous appear to include scenery from Zoo Tycoon? I might be wrong, but it would be foolish not to use a model that already fits what you want. Should they have modeled a new set of trees and bushes? Of course not. Why would they? It's such an inconsequential detail. They could have taken entire buildings from previous games and put them into use in small cityscapes that they show in the station rings and what have you. Only really the most eagle-eyed people will often even notice many of these things. These are good practices. Ideally, they'll be subtle, and we should always strive to create original content when it's warranted, characters, important set pieces, and so on, but we are also beholden to the size of our wallets, and sometimes we really have to work to make that dollar stretch. So sometimes we appropriate things from one game into another, like the above examples. And sometimes we reuse things within a game, like how the original Super Mario Bros. Even reused a recolored version of the clouds in the sky for the bushes on the horizon. Let's hear it for sprite economy. But sometimes good practices do go bad. I have the utmost respect for the people of BioWare. I consider myself lucky to call one of their alumni my friend, but even the greatest of studios can make a high-profile mistake. Dragon Age 2 was a very solid game when not compared against its very different predecessor. It played well as an action RPG and had some interesting story elements at the end of the day, but you'd never know it because its release was tarnished by the unfortunate lack of funding that it apparently had. It makes sense though when you consider it. Dragon Age Origins, the first of the series, was a massive undertaking, a spiritual sequel to the RPG that helped define a genre, Baldur's Gate. It was ridiculously ambitious, and it was set to be BioWare's fantasy Mass Effect. Unfortunately, that project came with a big price tag, so the sequel was understandably pushed out much sooner than it probably should have been in order to mitigate some of the costs of its big brother. It was standing on the shoulders of a giant, but that made a lot of its shortcomings all the more visible. While it created most of its assets from scratch, the amount of material available was sadly lacking. While the game did a great job basing its entire plot around the city of Kirkwall, the strings of the marionette were quickly cut when players realized that all of its quest dungeons, though supposedly taking place in different locations, were kind of the same map, down to the clutter within, with only minor changes in where the player entered the dungeon, which way they traveled through, and what doors would or would not open. If it had been a less high-profile title, or if it had found some way to convince players that the same mine just kept appearing as the location of various nefarious plots, it may have been able to escape some of the wrath of its detractors, but unfortunately it scuffed the Dragon Age brand name so much so that many had doubts as to whether Dragon Age Inquisition would be more of the same or not. It wasn't, though, for what it's worth. It was, in my humble opinion, among the best fantasy RPGs ever made. So let's zoom the camera back out to the industry in general while we wrap up. The simple fact of the matter is that, as stated a week ago, games are really expensive to make. Some corners kinda need to be cut in order to be sustainable. Many, if not most, game projects are designed now to be modular, to allow the developer to make use of parts of the game again when needed, and that should always be on a development team's radar. As a matter of fact, there's big business in game development in the reuse and even sharing of assets, you might be surprised to find. Anyone who's worked even casually in Unreal or Unity will already recognize this to a certain extent. I know for a fact that Premium Agency, a company I worked for in 2013, has a content database that it licenses to other studios full of props and other 3D assets. You'll probably be excused not being responsible for modeling every daffodil, rock, crate, or fire alarm in your game, though there is an obvious and mostly founded disdain for games that rely entirely on bought assets to make their games. This was a source of much criticism for some recent titles like Cat Simulator and Unit Z. There's always going to be a call for a certain amount of effort that is necessary before your game will be accepted. There's really no specific line where this is, but the short version is that people will disregard something that repeats itself too much, or God forbid other games too much. And that really isn't something that we should try to find a way around. But that doesn't mean that reuse won't or even shouldn't happen. What we need to do is be smart about it, and when you see another copy-paste in a sequel, maybe you'll start to think about why and see how they made use of what they're using. Because Infinity Ward wanted to keep a tested and fun map layout, and Capcom wanted to work with Disney, and Disney wanted an inexpensive game, because the palm trees are fine as they are, and because sometimes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's it for me for today. Thanks for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the show today, and if you liked the video and want to see more like it, we do ThursDev every Thursday, surprisingly, as well as a more casual podcasty type thing every Sunday. We also play games and say stupid things over them, so if you feel like hitting that big red subscribe button down below, that'll make finding the content that you enjoy that much easier. Or not. I'm just happy that you're here and watched all the way to the end. But for now, I'm off. Thank you again, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.